Hi, this is Prayer. We're at DBS Bristol, and today I'm doing a workshop in integrating classical music practice into music production. So a bit of background into me first, actually. So my artist name is Prayer. I produce electronic music, mainly sort of focusing and mixing sort of classical, cinematic, electronic elements. And I've done a few talks like this, sort of going through how to make what can be seen as a stuffy, like classical genre, making it more accessible and relevant to new audiences. So yeah, this will be about classical approach in production. So a bit more shameless plugging. So in terms of labels I've released on, Blackacre, which is a Bristolian label as well, and then also my own label I run called Grade 10 with 8 others. We do a variety of stuff from jungle to footwork, techno, all the genres under the sun. And yeah, so let's get going. So basically, what I'm going to be talking about is 6 basic elements of kind of music theory. It's stuff that goes across a breadth of backgrounds, but maybe for me, growing up in sort of a classical background, I've learned these and then I've learned how to integrate them in my production work. So firstly, we're going to look at orchestration. So you may know already, this is basically a fancy word for the arrangement of instruments. So what's the importance of this? It's basically adds colour to a piece as it progresses. So with music, it's just like an artist palette. We sort of add different colours as we go along, and the importance of this is it keeps everyone interested, like, because of the way the sounds change. In terms of, if you have one sound for a while, naturally your ears get bored of it. So what we can do is we can repeat the same thing, but in maybe a different register, switch it around, and then we're just not really changing much. It's just an easy way of progressing the sound without adding anything new. So, for example, techniques we have with this, so we could change which instrument holds the main body of a song throughout a piece. Say if, like traditional orchestral music, you might have some strings, we then might bring in the woodwind or the brass, and this just makes things a bit more lively. And then also as well, so using the most effective timbre or range of each instrument, just where whatever sounds good. So I'm going to play an example. So this is a track off an EP I did last year with Blackacre. Basically, if you just listen out for how it progresses, it kind of shifts up and down quite a bit using different ranges. So you'll see now it's about to shift upwards, the same instrument, just adding more colour. So coming up. So now. And then again, percussion's going to shift and we're going to have a lead cello line come in. Now an organ. So you get the idea of that one. It's basically, it's just one basic idea that's overlapping and gradually building like organically. So basically a bit more of a hands-on approach. If we just record something, I can show you what I mean a bit more in depth. So say, let's create an idea with a soft pad. Let's maybe get a bit of a loop going. Let's just record that. So nice little opening idea there. So what we have is something that's very sort of soft in approach. So that orchestration wise is a nice sort of gentle introduction. There was a tiny little mistake in there, so I'm just going to pretend that didn't happen and edit it out. Or add another one accidentally. So from that opening statement, we can then think, well, what can we do to push this along? So we're going to bring a different type of string palette in. So So you see how basically just from shifting those, let's take that back, shifting those two instruments is just a sudden like burst of life that comes in at that point. Now, I guess the way to look at it is, say like you're at a buffet, you're eating a lot of one type of food. The reason you can eat more and more is because you're eating different plates. So if you compare that analogy and cook an Ableton plate with it, you're all good. So other techniques we can do on top of that. So we've obviously changed instrument, but even within the same one, we can take, let's just push that aside. We can take the same sort of idea and just shift it upwards, so it might come something like this. So I didn't actually record that bit, which I should have done, but basically it's just, we've not really changed a lot in terms of what's playing, but we're just moving it about, and you can really, like, for me, when I first got into producing in terms of finishing a tune, like, I think I didn't know how to expand things, and just from taking those building blocks, I think it can make things a lot easier for everyone in that way. Great, so that moves us on to dynamics. So I think, obviously what was touched in the presentation before, like we can use velocity in a really like interesting way. And the thing is, like, when inputting MIDI sounds, you really want to sort of make it as natural as you can. So I always like prefer if I've got a fully weighted instrument, for example, but you don't have to, because what you can obviously do in Ableton, I'm sure you all know, is with these velocity sort of parameters here, just change it. But as you sort of play it naturally, you can see how they're all different. So I think like the key to any sort of successful writing in that way is just basically treat Ableton like it's a real instrument. Cool, so part writing. So this is basically the way melody and harmony are treated. So we have a few different ways in which parts can interact. So firstly, we have monophonic, which is obviously just one line. So the way you can build tracks of this, we might have sort of an opening low down. So that could be a useful introduction in that way. And then we could perhaps take the same thing. So when it becomes homophonic, this is basically when you've just got harmonies together, chords, for example. So the same thing could then be built into something like and so on. And then brings us on to polyphonic. So we can then expand things. This is basically when you have multiple melodies. So off the top of my head, I don't know, it could be something mental like. Something crazy like that. Obviously, you'd never record that because it sounds horrible, but you get the idea from that. And then this also expands into like specialist techniques. So call and response. This is really like, in terms of successful ideas, I think you really want to treat music as if it's a conversation almost. So call and response is when you sort of state one idea and then have it like mimicked or repeated at a different register. So it might be something like and that's the call, so the start of the conversation, and then the response might be. And then, I don't know, you can broaden that out into. It's just a nice little musical dialogue. And then equally imitation, so like call and response, again, it's a conversation, but this is where we have one part stated somewhere, and then immediately after, it might be in a different instrument, the exact same thing. So as before, it would be, and then, and that can really just keep on going on forever. Again, an extreme example, but you see what I mean. Sequencing. So this is, again, where you sort of have a part that replicates itself in a different register. So you might have an idea like this. And then other things we've got going. So another technique, again, can be doubling the octave. So you might have a line or a melody that's like. And what we can do to make this more interesting is just fill out the texture. So double the octave at the top. And then, as much as we want, we can fill in the gaps with that. So it could be. And so on. And also on pedal notes, so this is something I use quite a lot. A pedal note is basically when you have one sustained note and then stuff playing over the top of it. So I often start tracks with a sort of a bass line that would be maybe low down. chords, not that low down, but you get the idea. And then you basically just bring in harmonies over the top of it. So the bottom note is not moving at all. And what it can be is just a really good way to sort of build suspense, and when you do eventually shift down, like something like that. You just see it really sort of builds that up. It's like you're itching for a change and it never comes, and then it does come and everyone's laughing. I've put this little thing at the bottom which I can't remember adding, but for me, like, I don't know, there's a lot of, when learning to produce, there's loads of like emphasis on making a mix as well as you can. For me, like, I think personally, when you are adding so many notes, it gets more and more difficult. So I think just making a track as polished as it can for the sake of the mix is maybe, in my eyes, not the best way of doing things. Just musically make it work and then go with that. But yeah, just get it stem mixed maybe, who knows. So yeah, just a bit more about harmony actually. So this is obviously how the notes fit together. The reason I've basically, like, everything I've talked about so far is emphasised harmony really over melody to some extent. And the reason this is, I think, like, in terms of even electronic production, it's always about that bass hook or whatever, that synth lead at the top, but I think people often forget what comes into between. So a lot of amazing music for me, which, let's just, actually we'll leave that one out. It sort of begins with harmonious sounds, so yeah. And so within that, I've put sort of learned scales, but don't treat them as gospel. I get a lot of people, like, when they're asking about the sort of classical music background, they just assume, like, you know all the scales or whatever. But the thing within them is they're useful, but you want to break them. So interesting music comes from starting out in one key and maybe moving around. So a good example of that is the Twin Peaks theme. So and so from the start off, we're already starting with something interesting, that we're using inversions. So we're going in a whatever inversion chord that is, but we're sort of, rather than just sticking within C minor, we're creating sort of tensions. And then a key change to C major. So from C minor, we're going. Which then eventually leads us to the main theme, which is something like. And then again from C major back to C minor. It's just like the unexpected. Like, a lot of music does tend to stick in the one key. Obviously it's harder with, like, dance music. You don't want it to sound like John Michel Jarre or whatever too much. But it is, again, just different ways of experimenting with things. So, structure. So a lot of the music I do, I'm heavily influenced by minimalism. So everyone who doesn't know, sort of Philip Glass type sounds. And what these tracks do is it takes one simple idea and builds it into complex, different structures. just sort of nice little variations in with that arpeggio there. So you get the idea. That probably goes on like that for another 20 minutes. Okay, so let's again go back into Ableton, and we're just going to look at a couple of my tracks. So don't say if that wasn't that good. So a couple of tracks off some releases I did on grade 10 at the tail end of last year. I think this is the actual one, you never know. Always label your files correctly is the main thing. Cool, so basically this track I sort of build off this whole sort of arpeggio idea. Everything kind of relates to this in a way. So that second arpeggio has come in, mimicking it. And now what we have is another idea, just a lot more intense. Now back down to the sort of opening segment. And then finally, all together again. And then we end where we began. So yeah, just an example of like complex layering, particularly with this like end bit. I remember when I was at university, like one of my composition professors said like a key for him in electronic music is like subtlety. So something that's just barely audible. I know like the ending's not the best example of that, but just sort of bringing stuff back that you think, oh yeah, that's where that come from, came from. Cool, so just going to look at another one. So that was kind of more compositional. This one a bit more jungly or semi-jungle. So here again, I start with sort of a loop that's prominent throughout. And then just build up around that texturally. And then the breaks. It's only now that that first bit has dropped out and will come back, so it's all been based around that up until now. Yeah, so there we have it. Again, very much built around one idea and just weaving stuff in and out. It's the type of thing, again, like in terms of improvisation, you can really build on that. It could go on for days. So basically another part is mainly slightly underlooked, but I think everyone from time to time can struggle with writer's block. It happens to the best of us. So just little tips for that, really. Just the main thing is focusing on finishing a song rather than multiple projects. Like, I mean, even myself, there's probably like 1,000 Ableton projects called like lol 1 to 1,000 and stuff like that. But yeah, once you get out of that mode, you can really start doing stuff, but those lols will always be there as well. And also things I've noticed, like in terms of we live in an age where there's so much like information available to people that it's very easy to go down like a sort of rabbit hole of when you've been told something and then take that as the sort of mantra for what you're doing going forward. So don't be afraid to tell people to shut up in some sense. You might come away from this and think that was terrible, I'm not going to listen to that guy and that sort of thing. So yeah, and then also as well, obviously practice. Just keep on going at it. It's a nice little quote there from Marlowe: "I'm hitting my head against the walls, but they are giving way." Thank you. So thanks for watching. That was my workshop on integrating classical music practice into music production.